This video is brought to you by Against the Flow of Mississippi. Against the Flow of Mississippi is a book about Jake Fayard, a Marine veteran who is unhappy with the political machine running the state of Mississippi. He decides to fight the corruption from the inside. Jake will face more challenges than he ever has and will stand up for what he thinks is right. His notoriously hot temper will push him to the edge of murder, along with his friend and brother Kobe Barhanovich. Together, they will fight the system and give the power back to the citizens of Mississippi. Against the Flow of Mississippi is now available on Amazon. A link to the book will be placed in the description below. Welcome to History in the Eyes of a Southerner with your host, Anthony Allen. On this channel, we will take a journey through time and relate history to the contemporary eyes of modern America. I hope you enjoy the ride as I investigate and document the wonderful events that have shaped our present world. Alright, y'all. Time for another episode of History in the Eyes of a Southerner. I am your host, Anthony Oksenholt. And if you're wondering about why I said Oksenholt instead of Allen, I'll do a video on that later. But let's just say that the Allen name is going bye-bye. Anyway, I am doing another review of Atun Shei. The reason that I'm doing so much of his content is because his content is so thoroughly researched. And I like it. I really do. Anyway, we're going to do, or I am going to do, not we, I ain't got no mouse in my pocket. I am going to do the Checkmate Lincolnites episode of Did the Confederacy Have Better Generals? I've seen it before. And again, if you don't know who Atun Shei is, check out his channel. We differ. He is a bit of a soy boy, liberal, woke historian, but that's okay. I'm just playing with you, buddy. Actually, I think he's highly intelligent, and I also believe that a lot of what he says is right. So, let's get this thing started. Let's kick it in the ass.
Checkmate. What? Oh, there must be somewhere old Jeff Davis can go. Nope. Might as well change his name to Norman C. Francis because he is done.
I love changing his name to Norman C. Francis.
Never mind, just some local humor. Gracious. How long that game go on for? 7 months. Well, this is ridiculous. I never stood a chance. You were fighting with one hand tied behind your back, what with all your industry and naval power and some such. Naval power? What board game were you playing? But I think we both know who were the finer soldiers, the men of the South. Never before, in all the annals of military history, were there a finer collection of officers at war than those of the Confederate States Army. Lee, Jackson, Forrest, Longstreet, we don't talk about him, Beauregard, Mosby, and I'm sure there were some other ones too. Oh, the names of these men ring down through the generations as men of action, great masters of the art of war. If they were so good, why didn't they win? Checkmate, Davis Sights.
I mean, he's got
Sorry,
a
Billy,
point.
but it simply does not have quite the same ring to it
Painful
as
it is for me to admit
Checkmate
that.
Lincolnites! The program where we obliterate the righteous cause myth, a disgusting Yankee lie which dares to suggest that the sultry, balmy, beautiful South seceded from the Union over the issue of slavery. Could you imagine such a thing? Tonight, we shall prove once and for all the uncontested martial superiority of the Confederate soldier upon the field of battle. That's right, folks. The best generals were Southern. The Yankees won for a couple of reasons. They had more money and manpower. Given time, any fool can win a war of attrition.
That was part of it, sure, but don't you think you're overstating the case?
Nope. No, sir. No, sir. We were doomed from the start, and we only held on for as long as we did because our brave boys fought like wildcats. In battle, one of us was worth 10 of your effete urban Yankees and your immigrant hordes. Not to mention our ingenious commanders, who held on against the abolition army for longer than was thought possible, until after 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude,
Really?
we were compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers.
Surrender
and
speech?
resources.
Oh, I see what you're doing there. You're quoting Lee's farewell address after his surrender at Appomattox. You know, it's interesting because with the very verbiage of that address, Lee abrogates his own personal responsibility for defeat. It was all just overwhelming numbers and resources. No other reason. Certainly not Confederate mismanagement or the competency and skill of the United States Army. I mean, no. That would be crazy.
All right, so I've got to respond to this. My thoughts on the reason that the war was lost, one of many, but my theories, and I hate the Monday morning quarterback, but after 160 years, I mean, we kind of have no choice but to Monday morning quarterback. I mean, that's really the only way we can have these historical debates is if we sit back and go, that was a mistake, and look at it in the view of 2020 hindsight. I am going to say that the first thing that the South did wrong was move the capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. In fact, I think it was such a stupid move that had they kept the Confederate capital in the deep South, even if they would have, Atlanta would have been a better choice, in my opinion. Atlanta already pretty well had the infrastructure, but I'm going to say that because the Confederate capital was in Virginia, most of the fighting on the East Coast took place around Virginia. Took place around Virginia. Richmond being a mere 100-mile stone throw from Washington, D.C. Just a couple of days forced march if you really want to get down to it. That was a strategic mistake and one of the first. To start out, the Confederate administration tried to save Virginia. That was the whole point. And of course, we watch the movies, Gods and Generals, which I like. Atun Shei disagrees with. He thinks it's Confederate propaganda. Maybe it is. Except that part about the Yankees that are in there, like the 20th Maine. But we'll go with that. I think and I'm getting text messages here. Let me make sure it's nothing important. If it is, I'm going to be really mad because that means I have to start the video over. It's nothing important. Good. All right. They were trying to save Virginia. Robert E. Lee was from Virginia. Stonewall Jackson was from Virginia. A lot of the key generals were from Virginia. A lot of the movers and shakers that made the news and in later popular culture today were from Virginia. Very few people know who, say, William Barksdale was. The only reason that people know who Nathan Bedford Forrest was is because, allegedly, and I'm not saying he was or he wasn't, I'm not going to deny that he was, but I'm not going to say for a fact that he was because I don't really know for sure. But allegedly, he was the first he was one of the first founding members of the Ku Klux Klan. Do I believe he was in the Klan? Yes. Do I believe that the Klan is a horrible organization? Abso-fucking-lutely. Yes. You will never hear me apologize for them. Ever. But when you try to save Virginia because your capital is there, that's not very strategic. And it doesn't win you the war. Especially Virginia being a border state, a Confederate border state. Maryland was not a Confederate state, even though it was a slave state. At the time, Virginia bordered Ohio because West Virginia was a part of Virginia. We're talking 1861 here. Virginia bordered Pennsylvania. So one maybe and two solid, heavy northern states. Yeah, I don't think that's a good geographical place to put your capital. We'll continue in a moment.
I think you've really lost it. The North's industrial capacity was massive. See this photograph? This is the shipyard of one William Webb in the East River and Manhattan. This ironclad under construction is state-of-the-art, over 300 feet long, more than a match for any Confederate warship then in use. However, this behemoth would never face the Confederate Navy, for it was commissioned by the Italian Navy and would see service in the Battle of Lissa against Austria-Hungary in 1866. See, the North's industrial capacity was so humongous that it could not only more than provide for its own military, but for the militaries of other nations as well.
That's actually a really interesting tidbit. But, God isn't always on the side of the biggest battalions. History is full of wars where the side with the lower population and fewer resources won. The Haitian Revolution, the Vietnam War, the Winter War, the list goes on. Hell, I think you guys had a better chance of beating us in the Civil War than we had of beating the British in the Revolutionary War. And once or twice, he almost
I'll grant
did.
that.
Yes. If only Jackson had survived his grievous wound at Chancellorsville and went on to carry the day on July 1st at Culp's Hill. If only the Yankees had not found General Order 191 during the Maryland campaign, then old Moss Robert would have whooped Little Mac for sure. If only the British had joined us in the fight, and a great army of red and gray went a-marching all the way to Washington. If only Sherman would have spontaneously combusted at the Battle of Chattanooga, then Atlanta never would have fallen. If only we could have cloned Jeb Stuart so he could be in both the Western and the Eastern theaters at the same time, that would have shown the Federals a thing or two. If only Judah P. Benjamin had unleashed the power of the Ark of the Covenant, melting the faces off of all those Yankee scoundrels.
I'd like to formally apologize for what he just said about Judah P. Benjamin.
The world, we surely would have won the war then.
Circling back, history has shown that a large industrial capacity doesn't always correlate with a nation's ability or willingness to make war. Lest we forget, there was substantial anti-war sentiment in the North throughout the Civil War, especially in the summer of '64, when the public perceived that the war was going extremely badly for the United States. Keep in mind, this was after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, when the tide supposedly turned against the rebels. Now, of course, in hindsight, it's easy to say, the Confederacy was doomed at that point, but for people at the time, it was far from certain. During the grueling sieges of Petersburg and Atlanta, there was a tremendous amount of public pressure on President Lincoln to enter into peace negotiations with the Confederacy. It was only after Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Sheridan's scourging of the Shenandoah in '64 that the public began to regain hope that the war could be won. If the presidential election of 1864 had been held in August instead of November, then Lincoln probably would have lost and George McClellan would have become president. And if his timid conduct as commanding general of the army is any indication of how he would have conducted the war as president, I think it's pretty safe to say he would have given the rebels ample opportunity to bounce back.
Timid, yes.
Okay, so nobody likes war. Even me. And I don't like to call myself a military historian, although I love military history. I don't like to use the term military historian because I am not a veteran of the armed forces. Taking that in mind, for the purpose of what I'm about to say, I'm going to call myself a military historian. I don't like war. Looking at my life, I was against the first invasion of the Gulf, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and I'm not trying to get political here. I'm against what's going on in Ukraine. I don't like war. War is a continuation of politics by other means. Van Clausewitz said that. And that's very true. With this war that we're discussing, the quote-unquote Civil War, which I don't understand how this is called a civil war, because for a civil war, two powers have to try to take over the government of a country. The South wasn't trying to take over, it was trying to leave. So, keeping that in mind, I will call this the war between the states so that I don't offend any northern people who may view my channel. The war between the states was, quite honestly, a continuation of politics by other means. Lincoln wasn't on the ballot in several states in the South. Being that Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot and still won, war was declared. And that's the truth. That and nobody in the South, or very few in the South, cared for him very much. Which enters into why he was not on the ballot. Now, I don't agree with him not being on the ballot. I'm not a fan of Lincoln. But I think that he's got the right, if he met the criteria to run for president, he should have been on the ballot. As a member of the Libertarian Party that I am of the opinion that ballot access should be opened in all 50 states to all qualifying candidates who choose to run. So the South, in my opinion, was wrong on that. Again, not a fan of Lincoln. Never will be a fan of Lincoln. I did another video about the Emancipation Proclamation that should tell you how I really feel about Lincoln. That being said, war being a continuation of politics by other means, as was in 1861 through 1865, and then continuing on during military reconstruction of the South, yeah, Northern families were tired by 1864 of sending their sons to die in a war that they perceived was lost.
On that we can agree. A fine administrator.
Not such a great field commander.
Oh, I was half expecting you to defend McClellan and proclaim him as some sort of military mastermind, but not even you would stoop so low. How's that humble pie taste, Billy?
It's a little dry.
Well, you conceded a point, so I shall graciously return the favor. Perhaps I did exaggerate the role of industry in federal victory. However, if industry didn't do it, then the Yankee tendency toward tyranny certainly did. In the 20s and 30s, historian Frank L. Owsley argued that the Confederacy had, quote, died of states' rights. Our commitment to freedom was too great, that our states could not coordinate under a strong central power, and it hamstrung our war effort. What are your thoughts?
Owsley's full of shit. First off, his entire premise is a fiction. I mean, sure, Davis clashed with governors over stuff like troop allocations for local defense, but these were outlying events, the importance of which he greatly exaggerated. But more importantly, I just don't buy that the Confederacy's internal divisions were responsible for its defeat. The North had to deal with internal division that was just as, if not more intense than anything the South had to deal with. I mean, you take the 1863 draft riots, for instance, or the intense pressure on the Lincoln administration throughout the war for swift and spectacular battlefield victories, or the political polarization that followed the Emancipation Proclamation. Talk about hamstringing the war effort. No, any way you slice it, the Confederacy lost the Civil War on the field of battle. The Lincoln administration outmaneuvered them politically, and the boys in blue annihilated them militarily. Sometimes when you start a bar fight, you end up on the floor. It happens.
I notice a hero worship of the Northern generals and seething hatred of the Southern generals from our SJW historian. Why am I not surprised? He's looking for a narrative to sell instead of facts.
Why don't we break it down? What's so great about all these CSES generals? Go ahead, Johnny, ball's in your court.
I'll start strong, shall I? Thomas J. Jackson. He expelled the Yankees from the Shenandoah Valley in a near-flawless campaign of maneuver and decisively flanked Hooker's 11th Corps at Chancellorsville.
He also froze during the 7 Days battles when his lack of coordination with Lee and Longstreet caused horrifying numbers of unnecessary Confederate casualties. Look, I like Jackson, but I think his death was probably the best thing that could have happened to his reputation. He would have fallen from grace eventually. It was inevitable. I mean,
I'm not so sure about
fighting
that.
In the defensive grind of the Overland Campaign or the grueling trench warfare of Petersburg. His brilliance as an aggressive general was unmatched, but in many ways he was kind of a one-trick pony. And I think a compelling argument could be made that Jackson's offensive tactics ultimately did more harm than good. Take Chancellorsville, for example. Sure, he won a flashy tactical victory that fills the pants of military history nerds with buckets of jizz, but what did he actually accomplish, in the grand scheme of things?
He smashed the 11th Corps of the Union Army.
Okay, and?
And
he got a lot of his own troops killed, troops that Lee could not afford to lose.
You know what? He makes a valid point here. He makes a valid point. For every man that we lost, it would almost be like the North losing 5. That being said, that the population of the South, the white population of the South that fought, and of course that number of military eligible men would actually be reduced even further by the quote, I hate that I'm going to have to use this term, but the quote 20 Negro rule, which states that if you own 20 slaves, your oldest son was exempt from mandatory military service. If you owned 40, your oldest and second oldest son was exempt. And it goes up one generation, or one eldest for every 20. So let's just say we had somebody that had 200 slaves. And he had four grown men, or 4 military-age men in his family. All 4 would be exempt because of the so-called 20 Negro rule. So that dwindled our numbers. People who did not want to fight. Deserters, that dwindled our numbers. A lot of these things really hurt us as far as having able-bodied military men who were actually on the front lines versus the Yankees, where the largest cities were, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Chicago. I don't know if Chicago was really that big back then. But they did have the larger cities. They did have a larger population. And, of course, after 1863, the North allowed blacks to join and be soldiers, even though most of them at first were used in the pioneer brigades, which is basically manual labor. The South, though the pioneer brigades in the South that were building roads and fortifications and things like that, was still using some slave labor. And I'm not going to deny that. That actually did happen. But when you have slave labor doing this, and they're close to Union lines, you don't think them slaves would run away? So, I mean, we really had to watch the battles that we were going to fight in because of the manpower losses that we would take. So he does have a very good point here.
Time and again, throughout the war, rebel generals tried to one-shot Union armies with dramatic Jacksonian offenses. Sure, they might maul a corps and gain a victory, but the Yankees always came back. They never realized that gambling everything on one climactic, decisive, war-winning battle was just a plain bad bet, and it always cost the Rebs more than they gained.
Nitpicks, I say. You're finding fault where there is none. Stonewall Jackson was a mighty war chief, whereas the Union High Command, it was a veritable menagerie of nincompoops. Burnside, Pope, Butler, Banks, Meade.
Don't you dare talk shit about George Gordon Meade.
Oh, what? You'll scurry up to the top of a hill and wait for me to come charging after? Please, don't take much brains to defend high ground with superior numbers. The only reason we did not carry the field at Gettysburg was because of that scallywag Longstreet, dragging his heels instead of launching his crucial offensive in concert with Ewell and Illscott. And then, once we retreated, that old snapping turtle Meade did nothing to pursue us, instead allowing us to return to Virginia unmolested, a fact that vexed Abraham Lincoln to no end. As the tyrant himself said,
"You fought and beat the enemy at Gettysburg, and of course, to say the least, his loss was as great as yours. He retreated, and you did not, as it seemed to me, pressingly pursue him, but a flood in the river detained him, till by slow degrees you were again upon him. You had at least 20,000 veteran troops directly with you, and as many more raw ones within supporting distance, all in addition to those who fought with you at Gettysburg, while it was not possible that he had received a single recruit. And yet you stood and let the flood run down, bridges be built, and the enemy move away at his leisure without attacking him. My dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. If you could not safely attack Lee last Monday, how can you possibly do so south of the river, when you can take with you very few more than 2/3 of the force you then had in hand? Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably because of it."
Okay. Let me respond to the Longstreet comment. I believe Longstreet was right. He questioned the order. He 100% questioned the order from General Lee to attack at Gettysburg. And he was right. 2 days later, history would show exactly how right he was when, I'm sorry, but Gettysburg, we kind of got our ass kicked. There's no denying it. We kind of had to wear that ass whipping for a minute. And we didn't bounce back so easy after that, because think about what else we lost on the same at the same time we lost Gettysburg, we lost Vicksburg. Now, my theory is that Lee shouldn't have been that far north. I understand why, and that was certainly not the northernmost battle of the war. That would actually take place in, oh God, what's the name of that place in Vermont? I've been there, and I can't think of the name of it right now. It's up there north of Burlington, Vermont. It's on the tip of my tongue. It's a beautiful city. I've been there, and for some reason I cannot recall it. But the only action that was there was they robbed a bank. But anyway, if we would have stayed defending the South and not gone to Gettysburg, we wouldn't have lost so many very much needed troops. We lost a lot of manpower gambling. However, nobody was prepared to fight at Gettysburg. They just kind of met there. My theory is if Lee would have stayed the course and went on to Harrisburg, even though, again, I agree he shouldn't have been that far north, the war may have had a little bit better of a turnout for the South in 1863. But let's hear what Andy has to say. Go ahead, Andy.
Yes, he wrote that letter to Meade but never sent it because he realized that no good could come from chastising him after the fact. God, Lincoln was so fucking classy. But you know, I think his criticism here was actually pretty unfair. What everybody seems to forget is that right after Gettysburg, Meade was under orders to keep his army between Lee and Washington, D.C. at all times. If he had just gone charging after the retreating Confederates, he would have been acting in violation of those orders. Also, his army had just won the biggest battle fought on North American soil. That's definitely a consideration. They'd lost a full quarter of their combat strength, and high casualties among high-ranking officers had effectively decapitated the Army's leadership. It was also pissing rain that whole week, making all military operations more challenging. And while the Army of Northern Virginia was waiting for the swollen waters of the Potomac River to recede enough to ford, they dug entrenchments and threw up earthworks. They wanted Meade to attack them there.
Didn't this beer used to be called Dixie?
Meade was no Jackson, right? He never attacked without good intelligence and solid knowledge of his enemy's dispositions. Was he a military genius? No. Did he make mistakes? Yeah, of course. But as far as I'm concerned, in the Gettysburg campaign, he did pretty much everything right. Lee didn't lose that battle. George Meade won it. Very well, then. I propose we shift our focus to the west.
Yeah, I could go with that.
Woof. You sure you want to do that, Johnny? I do. Prepare to quake in your boots, Billy Yank, and allow me to present the most daring cavalry commander of the war. You know him. You love him. It's Nathan Bedford Forrest. Woo! Nathan Bedford Forrest, right. Slave trader, clan leader. Repentant clan leader. Oh, well, that's okay then. The South's greatest
That has nothing to do with the brilliance of his military and his military career and what he did. Not in 1861 to 1865. You want to talk about what he did after 1865? My advice, make one about what he did after 1865, which was horrible shit. Horrible shit. I will not disagree with that. But let's keep it military here for a minute.
Cavalry officer was indeed appointed first leader of the KKK.
he tried his best to keep it an honorable organization.
There's no fucking
Robert
way
E.
you
Lee
can
had
do
been
that.
offered the job first, but feeling that it would violate his parole and feeling that a younger man was needed, suggested Forrest.
I don't
The Klan
believe that
was
either.
Never an honorable organization. It was founded explicitly to terrorize black people and deprive them of their rights as American citizens.
Yes, it
now,
was.
Forrest worked hard to keep his association.
And it was also founded to fight military reconstruction in the South. But that goes right along with fighting the Freedmen's Bureau and basically everything that he just said. The Klan was nothing but a bunch of shitbags, period.
The Klan's secret. But it's not all that hard to piece everything together. In 1871, he was actually called to testify before Congress as part of an investigation
Where he
into the Klan's
lied.
terroristic activities. Here's what he had to say when Vermont Congressman Luke P. Poland asked him point blank if he was part of the Invisible Empire.
Are you a member of the Ku Klux, General? I'm not, but I am in sympathy and will cooperate with them. I know they are charged with many crimes that they are not guilty of.
Proof he lied. How would they know? How would he know that they are not guilty of the crimes that they were charged with if he wasn't a member? Honestly, I do believe he was a member. I do believe that. I do believe that he lied in this interview with Congress. Again, though, I'm not making this video to debate about his post-war fucked up activities, which I will admit were very fucked up. I'm doing this to talk about his military activities only. But, of course, this is one of the things I disagree with Atun Shei on is you can't take one without the other. And I think you can if you put it in the proper context.
What do you think of Negro suffrage? I am opposed to it under any and all circumstances, and in our convention urged our party not to commit themselves at all upon the subject. If the Negroes vote to enfranchise us, I do not think I would favor their disfranchisement. We will stand by those who help us, and I want you to understand distinctly that I am not an enemy to the Negro. We want him here among us. He is the only laboring class we have, and more than that, I would sooner trust him than the white scalawag or carpetbagger. When I entered the army, I took 47 Negroes into the army with me, and 45 of them were surrendered with me. I said to them at the start, this fight is against slavery. If we lose it, you will be made free. If we whip the fight, you stay with me, and bigger boys, I will set you free. In either case, you will be free. These boys stayed with me, drove my teams, and better Confederates did not live.
Black Confederates! Black Confederates!
They were Teamsters. Don't get excited. Come on, we've been over this.
Do you think the Ku Klux will try to intimidate the Negroes at the election? I do not think they will.
However, a black man named Andrew J. Flowers from Chattanooga also testified at the hearing, and he painted a very different picture of the Klan's activities in Tennessee.
Do you now hold some office?
Yes, sir. I am a Justice of the Peace.
When were you chosen Justice of the Peace?
I was elected on the 4th of late August.
Justices of the Peace in Tennessee elected by a vote of the people?
Yes, sir. I was elected by a vote of the people.
I want to inquire of you, particularly in reference to some violence, which it has been understood was committed upon you a short time ago. Tell us the story in reference to that.
On the 18th, between 11 and 12, or 10 and 11 o'clock, I cannot say exactly which, I woke up and there was a crowd of men, all with masks around me, with pistols in their hands. They waked me up. They called me by my name. They took me out near a mile from the house.
Tell all that they said.
They asked me what was my name. I told them. And some of them said, "Oh yes, you are the man we are looking for," and so forth. One of them told me they were gonna kill me. He had a pistol in his hand. After they got me out of doors, the captain of the organization, they called him Captain, told me that he was going to whip me. Said he would give me 25 lashes. That I had the impudence to run against a white man for office and beat him. That they were not going to allow it. That it was an organization organized by them to stop Negroes holding office. And if they did not get out of office by being told or notified or whipped, they were going to kill them. They took me up about a mile from the house and hit me as many as 25 times.
Did they take you into a woods or a swamp?
They took me through the woods into an old field, down near a swamp. I had never been there before. They took off my coat and whipped me with hickories 7 or 8 feet long. They said they were going to give me 25 lashes, and I guess they gave it to me. They told me that if I would promise to resign my office when I went to Chattanooga next morning, they would turn me loose. And I very readily promised it.
They required you to promise to resign your office.
Yes, sir.
Flowers went on to describe how the Klan was using intimidation and violence to keep black men from voting, along with many other acts of domestic terrorism that Nathan Bedford Forrest not only aided and abetted, but more than likely orchestrated.
Oh, you are dastardly Billy Yankin besmirching General Forrest, so you know as well as I that in 1875 he gave a speech to a black civics organization in Memphis in which he said,
We have but one flag, one country. Let us stand together. We may differ in color, but not in sentiment. Many things have been said about me which are wrong, and which white and black persons here who stood by me through the war can contradict. Go to work, be industrious, live honestly, and act truly. And when you are oppressed, I'll come to your relief.
The speech went over stupendously, and as the crowd erupted in acclamation, one African-American woman gave the old general a bouquet of roses and a peck on the cheek.
Yeah, he said that toward the end of Reconstruction, after the Klan's goal of reestablishing the antebellum social order had been accomplished. Southern Democrats were back in power at that point, and Forrest could afford to be magnanimous. I think his message here, though presented in a very nice and friendly way, was work hard, stay in your lane, and we won't have a problem. Now, I'll grant you this, man. It is also entirely possible that Forrest did have a genuine change of heart. I'm not discounting that. A lot of people at the time thought so. In fact, when a lot of Forrest's former comrades in gray heard about this speech, they shit a brick. One Confederate veterans group went so far as to publish this in their local paper.
We endorse no action unworthy of a Southern gentleman. I speak of the address delivered before a black and tan audience by General Nathan Bedford Forrest. With what a glow of enthusiasm and thrill of pride have I not perused the campaigns of General Forrest's cavalry, their heroic deeds, their sufferings, and their successes under the leadership of one whom I always considered, in my poor judgment, second only to our immortal Hampton. And now, to mar all the luster attached to his name, his brain is turned by the civilities of a mulatto wench who presented him with a bouquet of roses. What can his object be? Ah, General Forrest.
Well, Billy, I won't lie to you. That's really quite vile. Can we go back to talking about military history now? I found it to be much more comfortable and safe.
One more point. Listen. Forrest is unbelievably overhyped, but he was a competent general. He was also a mass-murdering terrorist piece of shit and should be remembered as such. In my opinion, just about every positive mention of his generalship should be accompanied by extreme moral condemnation and acknowledgement of the U.S. colored troops he massacred without quarter at Fort Pillow.
But can't we celebrate his military achievements without glorifying his less savory attributes?
Yeah, and we could also celebrate Osama bin Laden's dexterous use of Expedia.com, but that'd be pretty fucking weird, wouldn't it?
You know what I think? I think you're compensating for something. Y'all didn't have a daring, brilliant cavalry commander.
Now that I've taken my phone call and completely lost my train of thought, let's continue.
On your side during the war, so you're just trying to knock one of ours down a peg.
I'll see your Nathan Bedford Forrest and raise you Colonel Benjamin H. Grierson, who led a ridiculously clever cavalry raid down the length of Mississippi during the Vicksburg campaign. Though the initial purpose of the raid was to cut the railroad east of Jackson, Mississippi, Grierson went above and beyond the call of duty, going from LaGrange, Tennessee to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, wreaking havoc all the while. Grierson and his troopers broke up 2 other railroads, destroyed weapons and commissary stores, burned storehouses, disabled trains, and freed slaves. All in all, they inflicted millions of dollars worth of property damage on Mississippi and permanently crippled that state's military usefulness for the rest of the war. They also diverted substantial numbers of Confederate cavalry that were badly needed in the defense of Vicksburg itself. But possibly most impressive of all, Grierson accomplished all of this at the cost of 3 men killed and 7 wounded. Contrast that with Forrest's raids. Sure, they were flashy and daring, but did they make a huge difference to the outcome of those campaigns? I wouldn't say so. And to my mind, I think you guys only had one strategically minded general who thought of things in terms of the big picture rather than individual maneuvers and battles. And he was, of course, Joseph E. Johnston.
Wait, who?
Joseph E. Johnston. I think he was the only senior Confederate general who understood that when you're fighting with limited manpower, you need to pick your battles literally very, very carefully.
I can agree with that.
Most generals thought of war in terms of attacking or defending dots on a map. They were very geographic in the way they went about it. But Johnston understood that when you're outnumbered and outgunned, stubbornly holding on to bits of dirt can often be counterproductive. Maneuver, even strategic retreat, can be much more beneficial in the long run.
There is no way to fight with honor.
Yeah, that's what Jeff Davis often said, which is exactly why Johnston hated him so much and privately talked all sorts of shit about Jackson and Lee. Whereas...
You know what? I actually agree with that. I agree with that. 100%. Johnston did see the big picture. And nobody would listen to him. And that cost us a lot of men, which in turn, I think, cost us the war. I will agree with that all day.
As it must be said, our side was full of keenly strategic military minds. Look no
I
further
wouldn't
than
say
George
that.
Henry Thomas, the Virginian Unionist. Like Meade, he was deliberate and never imperiled the lives of his men unnecessarily. But unlike Meade, he was creative. He was adaptable. He could always shift his strategy in the chaotic and ever-changing circumstances of warfare.
George Thomas, that is strange. I really haven't heard much about this faithless Virginian.
Well, that's because he was modest to a fault. In fact, he probably wouldn't want me to even mention him in this video, because he never wrote a memoir, and he even destroyed his wartime correspondences because he couldn't stand the idea of future generations picking over the events of his life.
And you know what? I'll be honest. Before I watched this, I've never heard of him either.
He also faced a lot of discrimination from his northern superiors because of his southern origins, and he was often overlooked for promotions and acclamations.
Typical.
I'm with you there. And ever since, General Thomas has been kind of forgotten about by historians, despite the fact that he was a huge badass. In a skirmish before the First Battle of Bull Run, he actually went toe-to-toe with Stonewall Jackson and kicked his fucking ass. At the disastrous Battle of Chickamauga, when William Rosecrans, the Union Army commander, fled the field, Thomas remained behind, fighting on alone with his men against the whole Reb army, badly outnumbered and outflanked. And this holding action single-handedly saved the Army of the Cumberland from complete destruction. And 2 months later, United States forces would get their revenge at the Battle of Missionary Ridge, where Thomas and William Tecumseh Sherman orchestrated a frontal attack on the Confederate center that shattered their lines, and those lines, might I add, were entrenched on high ground. And then, in December 1864, Thomas faced off against John Bell Hood, who sucks, by the way, in the Battle of Nashville, and destroyed his army. That's not hyperbole. He literally destroyed it. The Army of the Tennessee was laid low, its ruin smote upon the mountainside. There would be no more large-scale fighting west of the Appalachians for the remainder of the war.
I'm going to go ahead and agree. John Bell Hood was pretty much a fucking empty uniform.
George Thomas never lost a movement or a battle, and may very well have been the best general on either side in the entire conflict.
Lord almighty. What else this fella do? Cure cancer?
Though as far as good Union generals go, there's one person that we haven't talked about yet.
Let me guess. Sherman. Do it again, Uncle Billy.
Fuck you, Uncle Billy, war criminal.
Besides, we've already done an entire episode about him.
No. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. No. Sherman is but the apprentice. He is the master.
Sir, lords of this state,
This is so epic.
and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender surrender can be accepted,
Johnny! Hey! Are you alright? We were talking and
That
you
was
started
epic as
screaming.
hell.
Are you alright?
Yes, I'm fine. Just a minor hallucination.
Do you hallucinate often?
No?
Anyway, about Ulysses S. Grant. I mean, he was just a beast. I mean, that's the man who saved the Union.
Oh, so now Grant wasn't a drunk and didn't run up a horrific casualty rate amongst his troops. Forget the lost cause. All currently revisionist history has done to canonize the North and demonize the South.
Well, that depends on what you mean by a drunk. I mean, he definitely abused alcohol, but whether he was a occasional binge drinker or you want some? Or a full-fledged alcoholic, I mean, that's kind of hard to determine.
No, he was a drunk.
Cheers.
Cheers. If the Butcher Grant is the best you Yankees have to offer, then I'm afraid you are in a heap of trouble. For there is simply no comparison betwixt the Butcher Grant and old Moss Robert E. Lee. In the words of Jubal Early,
shall I compare General Lee to his successful antagonist? May as well compare the Great Pyramid, which rears its majestic proportions in the valley of the Nile, to a pygmy perched atop Mount Atlas.
Nice one, Jubal. Wonderful use of very specific North African imagery. You really showed that Butcher Grant what's what.
You keep calling Grant a butcher. Why is that?
Because his generalship contained no spark of military genius. His idea of war was to the last degree rude. No strategy, the mere application of the wing's inertia. He had none of that quick perception of the field of action which decides it by sudden strokes. He had no conception of war beyond the momentum of numbers. Such was the man who marshaled all the material resources of the North to crush the little army and overcome the consummate skill of General Lee.
That's a very common and especially Eastern theater-centric misconception, and it mainly stems from Grant's battles against Lee in 1864, namely the Overland Campaign. And yes, to be fair, the casualties in that campaign were appallingly high on both sides.
And though y'all eventually won, your casualties were higher than ours. We lost approximately 33,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Y'all lost 55,000 men killed, wounded, or missing.
Well, we were on the offensive during the Overland Campaign, and attackers do tend to take more casualties than defenders, especially since the war was becoming steadily more brutal, as tactics slowly transitioned between Napoleonic-style open-field-type warfare and kind of proto-World War I, deeply entrenched warfare of attrition. That was not the sort of campaign that Grant was trying to fight, by the way. He actually wanted to maneuver Lee into fighting an old-fashioned open-field type of battle, where he could bring his superior numbers to bear more effectively. But it was Lee who decided to entrench, so he could better protect Richmond and Petersburg. It had been something he had been threatening to do for a very long time. But Grant was grimly determined and kept the pressure up until the United States achieved a costly but decisive victory.
Which brings me to my point earlier of the Confederacy was trying to save Virginia and lost the rest of it, including Virginia.
What about the Yankee defeat at Cold Harbor, or the Turkish shoot slaughter at the Battle of the Crater?
Yeah, I mean, those two failed attacks were huge mistakes and resulted in a horrendous and completely unnecessary loss of life. But it's important to understand that those missteps were the exception of Grant's generalship, not the norm. You see, Grant had a truly national view of the conflict. Now, there's no way to say this without coming across at least a little bit cold-blooded, but it's a tragic fact. The carnage of the Overland Campaign was necessary to bring the war to a timely conclusion, which Grant did after less than a year in overall command of the United States forces. Contrast that with his predecessors in the East, like McClellan or Burnside, who racked up significantly higher casualties than Grant did, with significantly less to show for it. Grant and Lincoln had a very specific strategy in Virginia at the end of the war, to grab Lee by the neck and to squeeze and to keep squeezing, never giving him a moment's repose, never allowing him for a second to even think about going on the offensive.
Mr. President, if we are to draw troops from the field, it will prove difficult to suppress the rebellion in the disloyal states. My withdrawal now from the James River would ensure the defeat of Sherman.
General Grant, I have seen your dispatch expressing your unwillingness to break your hold where you are. Neither am I willing. Hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible.
And as battered as Grant's army was, Lee's had suffered far worse, losing a full half of its combat strength in the overland campaign alone. And while the United States could always augment its forces with fresh troops, the Confederate States were running out of options. As Grant himself reflected,
The rebels have now in their ranks their last man. The little boys and old men are guarding prisoners, guarding railroad bridges, and forming a good number of their garrisons for entrenched positions. A man lost by them cannot be replaced. They have robbed the cradle and the grave equally to get their present force. Besides what they lose in frequent battles and skirmishes, they are now losing from desertions and other causes at least one regiment per day.
Sounds an awful lot like what I was just saying about overwhelming us with numbers.
Lee wasn't overwhelmed. He was outgeneraled. The Union had learned from experience.
I don't know if I agree with
numbers
that.
And resources don't win wars on their own. So what they needed was a general who could effectively utilize those numbers and resources, which is exactly what Grant did. He pinned the Army of Northern Virginia down in Richmond and Petersburg while Sherman ravaged the Deep South and closed Lee's back door. Joe Johnston and P.T. Beauregard, who were at that time defending Georgia and the Carolinas respectively, did all they could to keep that trap from swinging shut, but Lee, meanwhile, just froze. He stayed put, and he allowed himself to be obliterated.
Nonsense. Protecting Richmond and our center of government was essential to our survival.
No, it wasn't.
Okay, but while Lee was busy defending...
Okay. Do you remember back just about, I don't know, almost 90 years before what they're talking about was going on, the seat of government in the U.S. at the time was Philadelphia. The Redcoats took Philadelphia. And again, just a couple of decades after that, or a few decades after that, in the War of 1812, Washington was taken and captured and burned by, again, the British and Canadian forces. Taking the seat of government in the United States didn't affect the overall outcome of those wars, which in fact the U.S. won. The Continentals won, obviously, the Revolutionary War, which is why we're not holding British passports in this country. And again, the U.S. forces beat the British in the War of 1812. Again, another testament to that is we don't have British passports in this country. That being said, taking Richmond, if they would have let Richmond go, yes, it would have hurt morale. Yes, it would have caused a lot of pushback from the Southern populace, but I don't think it would have ended the war the way that they think it would have. Again, another argument, and I hate the Monday morning quarterback, but this is kind of what we're doing here. Another argument for leaving the capital in Montgomery as it originally was. And again, if James Madison could run the government from the back of a horse in the War of 1812, or from a post office, I'm pretty sure the Confederate government could have done the same.
Virginia to the last, Sherman snuck up behind him and rammed a boot up his ass. It was
And I
a
agree
losing
with that.
strategy, and Lee is more culpable than you realize. For what shall it profit a man if he gains Virginia but loses the whole South?
But for
Right.
most of the war, Lee's entire mandate was his beloved Virginia. He wasn't even appointed General-in-Chief of all Confederate armies until February of 65.
Maybe not officially, but Lee was massively influential in the Confederacy and had been since 1862. And, I mean, shit, he was the face of the rebellion. Lee was myopic about defending his home state, and multiple times, when key positions in the Western theater were under dire threat, he flat out refused to send any of his troops to help.
Yes, he
in
did.
mid-1863, when Grant was tightening the noose around Vicksburg and the rebel army ensconced there, Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon urged Lee to send George Pickett's division west. Lee responded with a refusal, of course, and it was full of excuses, some reasonable, others bizarre.
The adoption of your proposition is hazardous, and it becomes a question between Virginia and the Mississippi. The distance and uncertainty of the employment of the troops are unfavorable. If you determine to send Pickett's division to General Pemberton, I presume it will not reach him until the last of this month. If anything is done in that quarter, it will be over in that time, as the climate in June will force the enemy to retire. I think troops ordered from Virginia to the Mississippi this season would be greatly endangered by the climate.
And the one time Lee did acquiesce to reinforcing the West.
Which, by the way, leads to the fact that the main part of the Confederacy only cared about the Eastern Theater. And the reason, again, is because they kept the capital in Richmond. But here's my, well, you know what? I'm going to give my conclusions at the end of the video here, which we still have quite a ways to go.
When he sent Longstreet's corps to North Georgia and made a key difference in defeating the U.S. Army at Chickamauga.
And then the scalawag allowed himself to get licked by Ambrose Burnside, of all people. Pathetic. In any event, Lee was right. He was handily outnumbered, and he hadn't a man to spare.
Well then,
Lee was
why did
wrong.
he always get them killed at such an astounding rate? If anybody deserves to be called a butcher, it's Bobby Lee.
Moss Robert? No. He loved us. He never threw our lives away needlessly.
I
Except
wouldn't
he
say
totally did. Like, all the time.
Nope. That's your boy Grant you're thinking of. He didn't care a whit about his men. He just threw waves of conscripted children to their deaths.
Let's crunch some numbers. Lee's greatest victory was the Battle of Chancellorsville. His army was about 60,000 strong and suffered nearly 13,000 casualties, a net loss of 22%. His opponent, Joe Hooker, had an army 133,000 strong and suffered about 17,000 casualties, a net loss of 12%. The victory, though tactically brilliant, gained no ground for the Confederacy, reaped no major strategic benefit, and resulted in the death of Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's best generals. Grant's greatest victory was the Siege of Vicksburg. His army was 45,000 strong and suffered 3,000 casualties, a net loss of 7%. His opponent, John Pemberton, had an army about 40,000 strong and suffered 7,000 casualties dead, wounded, or missing, as well as a staggering 33,000 captured, a net loss of effectively 100%. The victory secured the Union's complete control of the Mississippi River and brought about the capture of the nearby state capital of Jackson. It ended rebel resistance in the region, exposed the Confederacy's soft underbelly of East Tennessee and Georgia, and was a crucial step toward final victory. Throughout the war, in the battles for which reliable statistics exist, Lee suffered an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 20.2%, and inflicted an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 15.4%. In total, 121,000 of the men under his command were killed and wounded, the highest of any general in the Civil War. Grant, on the other hand, suffered an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 18.1%, and inflicted an average killed or wounded casualty rate of 20.7%. In total, 94,000 of the men under his command were killed and wounded, 23,000 in the Western Theater and 71,000 in the East. Look, Lee was a good general. Sure. I venture to say he did a better job leading the Army of Northern Virginia than I would have done. I'm not trying to unduly demonize him here or exaggerate his faults, but a military genius? The greatest field commander in American history? No. That's a fairy tale. born from more than a century of creepy, pseudo-religious deification. In many ways, the comparison between Grant and Lee tells us all we need to know about why the war went the way it did. Lee led with the power of personality. He thought that war should be grand, sweeping, and heroic. He loved dramatic charges and clever tactical sleights of hand. He considered logistics to be an annoyance rather than an opportunity, which is why Confederate military history is full of flashy daring-do, but pretty short on substantial operational success. Grant, meanwhile, was all stubbornness and pragmatism. War was not a game to him. There was nothing poetic about it. Like his buddy Sherman, he believed that to wage war meant to bring it to a favorable conclusion as quickly as possible. And to achieve victory, he used every tool available to him. Deception, diversion, maneuver, relentless attack, and dogged defense, and never lost sight of the big picture. Battles didn't really matter that much in of themselves. They were just stepping stones toward the distant goal of ultimate victory. And that's why, for the most part, the Confederacy did not have better generals. You were obsessing over tactics while we were planning strategies. You thought small, we thought big. That's why we won.
And to bring that point a little bit further home, if the Confederacy wanted to bring the war to a swift end, they were already at Manassas. They already won the first Battle of Manassas, or the first Battle of Bull Run, depending on which side you were on. Why didn't they just take D.C. when they were there? They had the Union with their pants down. This goes with what Andy just said. You know, it was, I guess, poetic would be a good way to put it. And it shouldn't have been, because war is ugly. War is hell, period. War is, I am going to inflict as much as I can on you. I am going to kill as many of you as I can to get the result that I want. And that's exactly, I hate to admit it, I am not a fan of the war criminal. But on this, I do have to give Grant and Sherman credit, because when they were up in Ohio and they devised that plan to bring total war, Sherman took Atlanta. They started fighting on two fronts, fighting like hell on two fronts at that. You have the Army of the Potomac versus the Army of Northern Virginia. And then you had Sherman down in Georgia. And what they did is they closed the gap. And when they closed that door on them, I mean, you can't run south, you got Sherman up your ass. You can't run north, you got Grant in your face. So, I mean, if we would have thought like that and fought like that, instead of trying all this grand shit, yeah, I think the war would have come out a whole lot different. I have to agree.
Look at you. Smugly conducting military campaigns 150 years after the fact from the comfort of your armchair.
This chair doesn't have arms.
General
Come to think about it, this one doesn't either.
By far the better man. Look no further than how Grant and Lee treated their slaves. Grant kept his and said he not raise his sword to free any slave. Lee, on the other hand, freed his. He acquired them in marriage and treated them justly.
That's maybe like a quarter true. In the mid-1850s, Grant did manage about 30 enslaved people at his father-in-law's farm. By all accounts, he was a terrible slave driver because he was too gentle with them.
A woke slave driver is still a slave driver.
I couldn't agree more, and Grant was, briefly, a slaveholder himself. He owned a man named William Jones for about a year before freeing him in March of 1859.
Yes, Grant was a slave owner, and General Lee was, of course, an abolitionist.
No.
He called slavery a moral and political evil. I have a quote.
In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country.
Yeah, and in that same letter he also says,
The systematic and progressive efforts of abolitionists to interfere with and change the domestic institutions of the South are truthfully and faithfully expressed.
But what does this have to do with military?
They must also be aware
What does this have to do with military greatness is what I want to know.
And can only be accomplished by them through the agency of a civil and servile war. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence.
If Lee believed slavery was an evil, he thought it was a necessary one. And actions speak louder than words, right? Hiring records show that Lee personally owned people until at least 1852, and frequently sold or traded them away at his own convenience, even though that meant breaking up their families. Evidence from his personal letters shows that when Lee did free his slaves, he didn't do it out of the kindness of his heart, but rather because he hated supervising them and didn't want them around. When he briefly managed his wife's slaves at their house in Arlington, he was a notoriously cruel slave master and drove his people hard. As late as July 1860, he considered buying even more slaves and rented out slaves as personal servants throughout the entire Civil War.
Well, it's not
I'm not done. Politically, Lee consistently supported pro-slavery policies, and after the war upheld laws specifically designed to restrict the rights of freedmen. He also frequently expressed racist views, which were certainly very much in keeping with his time, but are still a far cry from our popular image of the kindly General Lee. During his time in Mexico, he found the people of that country to be
weak, primitive in their habits and tastes.
He referred to Native Americans as
hideous, uninteresting.
And the only people he seemed to have any affection for at all were, predictably,
though climate, government, and circumstance have produced changes in the character of people, yet in all essential qualities they resemble the races from which they are sprung. And to no race are we indebted for the virtues and qualifications which constitute a great people than the Anglo-Saxon.
Again, this has nothing to do with his military actions in the war between the states. So we've kind of gotten a little off topic here, Andy. Nobody, well, at least I'm not, and I don't know any pro-Southern person around that is saying or advocating that slavery was good. It was horrible. It was fucking slavery. It was brutal. It was cruel. I'll admit that all day long. I will never apologize. Let me back up. I will never advocate for slavery. I think it was immoral. I'm not saying that my ancestors who fought for the Confederacy owned slaves. Many of them did not. I'm not saying that slavery wasn't an issue, because it was, and it became the issue of the war, but the war did not start out fighting against slavery on either side, for or against.
Your sainted Grant was no better. Did you know that he was a rabid anti-Semite? In December of 1862, a handful of businessmen, some of them Jewish, were illegally selling cotton in Grant's military district. So he issued General Orders No. 11, which expelled all Jewish people from the area under his military control. The order read,
The Jews, as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department, and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department.
Okay. anti-Semitism was kind of normal, albeit inexcusable, through much of history. I don't understand why. I've never understood it. I've certainly never agreed with it. But it was just, it not excusing it, but it was there. It happened. North and South. In fact, if it wasn't for Judah P. Benjamin, the South would have been quite a bit more anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and the verbiage of the order reflects old European stereotypes about Jews too. So, a super bad look, and you will not find any argument from me. Unsurprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, the order was met with general public outrage. Lincoln was horrified and immediately rescinded Grant's edict. And though the general insisted that it was all a big misunderstanding, the controversy would haunt him for the rest of his life. Especially during his presidential run, he issued multiple public apologies. Was he sincere? Who is to say?
Probably not.
He was a politician, after all. You know, Johnny, here's what I think it really comes down to as far as how we choose to remember these men. Here's what I think. Are you ready?
Spit it out.
Here's what I think. Ulysses S. Grant was instrumental in bringing about the end of slavery in this country. Bobby Lee tried his very best to keep the damn thing going.
Agree to disagree.
I'll agree to disagree.
You always get diverted into talking about race.
It's almost as if racism and the Civil War are pretty closely interrelated.
I must say, sir,
Debatable.
I found your arguments thoroughly unconvincing. And if I may be so bold as to remark, even more biased than usual. You know, I really don't like it when you say those sorts of horrible things about General Lee.
Look, Johnny, I'm not trying to pick on you, all right? It's just that lost causers have been sucking Lee's dick for 140 years. It's like the longest blowjob in American history, and it's left a real stain on this country. I'm not trying to paint him as some horrible monster. I'm just course-correcting against generations of hero worship.
Well, could have fooled me. I believe, sir, that I shall take my leave of you now.
Come on, dude. Don't be like that.
See you in hell, Billy Yank.
See you in hell, Johnny Reb.
Okay. Conclusions. There were great generals on both sides. There were shitty generals on both sides. Don't even get me started on PGT Beauregard. Please don't get me started on PGT Beauregard. I'm so glad that he wasn't even mentioned in this, except that he was over the South Carolina district in 1864 and 65. Lee had some great tactics. He was a good tactician. They didn't call him the wily gray fox for nothing. I mean, he earned that. Grant was one stubborn son of a bitch. I will give you that all day long. And that helped to win the war for the North. That being said, do I think that the South had better generals? Hard to say. We lost. Do I think the North had better generals? Hard to say. They won. And that's really what it boils down to. Y'all have a good day. History with a Southern accent. And by the way, go check out Atun Shei's page. Highly recommend it. There's a lot more on his page than just Checkmate Lincolnites. And I have learned a lot from him. Again, I am a fan. Y'all have a good one. Take care. History in the Eyes of a Southerner. Your host, Anthony Oksenholt.